Judie Fortier, you definitely look to history for much of your career, and you've been able to pull through these women that otherwise might have been lost to time in their wisdom. You spent 30 years, Judie Fortier, working at the Women's Rights Office of the City of Tacoma. The Washington State Supreme Court appointed you to the court's Gender and Justice Commission. You've served on lots of city, county, state boards, commissions, and you've been a longtime member of the National Organization for Women. You served as the Tacoma president and the Washington State president of NOW, and you also served 4 years on the NOW National Board. You grew up here. You're the daughter of a union organizer and a public school music teacher. You've gone through so much in your career. What was your dream when you were a girl growing up here in Tacoma?
Well, that's really easy. Dreams, right? Actually, like the two stories you previously heard, I am the daughter of Marie. I am the granddaughter of Mavis and Violet, and I am the great-granddaughter of two Elizabeths. My middle name happens to be Elizabeth. But I came from a time, I think, where we didn't know a lot about the women's movement. Most of the people who we admired were in our homes. But when I look back at that, I was a South Tacoma girl. You have to be a South Tacoma girl to know what it's like to grow up in Tacoma. I mean, we got beat up because we grew up in South Tacoma. Now, nobody knows that very much about South Tacoma girls, but I know. One of my friends, Elaine, is in here. She and I went to school together. We know what it was like. And there's something about being little and having to be just a little bit tough to make it even through elementary school. So let me tell you what my elementary school was like. Anyone know where Arlington Elementary School is? That's the area of town I grew up in. Okay, the girls, of course, I'm looking at Vivian over here. Vivian, I couldn't even wear pants. When we went to elementary school, you had to wear a dress or a skirt. No pants allowed. Not even on a Friday. No pants. The boys had the big field down below Arlington. They got to do team sports and everything. And us girls, we were up above, you know, doing like jacks and throw the ball or whatever. And so we grew up, you know, with Dick and Jane. I call that now Dick and Jane as victims. Because Jane, if you ever heard this, hold this mic. If you look at a Dick and Jane book, right? Here's Jane. No hands. She never had any hands. Never, you know? And Dick, of course, Dick got to do everything. You know, Dick was busy, he had a dog, he got to play games or whatever. And Jane. Yeah, so that's how I grew up, South Tacoma. We were tough. We were some tough girls. Luckily, we had Girl Scouts. We had mothers who were willing to be Girl Scout leaders, and I went for the cookies and for the Kool-Aid that my mother wouldn't let me drink, and those badges. You had to get a badge. You know, so we learned a lot. We did learn about history. We learned about the leader. Now I'm trying to think of her first, Harriet Lowe, I think, right? Lowe. We learned what it meant to pledge to God and our country and to be good girls. Very important. Some of us just never could really be good. I don't know. I don't know what it is. Maybe a labor union daddy and, you know, a mother with a very good voice that I didn't inherit any of that. You know, my sister get up, play the piano. She was really good. Me, wouldn't practice. Couldn't really learn the piano very well. But I was a Girl Scout. I was cool. So then I had to go to grade junior high. That's a whole other story. We won't go there. We'll leave that to the teachers. And then Mount Tahoma. Just to put it this way, I was lucky never to be kicked out of school. My father threatened he'd send me to Reman Hall. I mean, all kind of things happened to me in junior high. And then off to high school, I went at Mount Tahoma. When I finally decided, there was no discussion in our family if you were going to college. There was none. My daddy never got to go to college. My mother went to WSU, and that was another thing. You aren't going anywhere but WSU. That's where we went. My sister went first. I went second. I'm a cougar. And, yeah, I'm a cougar. Yeah. But so I go off to WSU, and I was going to be a firefighter. Now, mind you, have any of you seen a 5-foot firefighter? No. So they kind of talked me out of it in school that, no, can't be a firefighter. Good. So I go through the catalog for WSU, and I find police. I go, yeah, I think I'll be a police officer. Well, it was woman back there, police woman. Okay, 1965, there was a show on TV called Honey West. Honey West was the bomb. I'm not kidding you. She was about 6 feet tall, gorgeous, drove a sports car. She was a detective. I said, I'm going to be Honey West. That is what I'm going to be. So off to college, I go to be Honey West. I'm going to be a cop. My parents are like shaking their heads like, oh, God. Yeah, she's going to be a cop. Okay. So at least she's going to college. So off to college I go. So I walk all proudly and everything into the police science school and start looking around. And this is where we go to the other stories here, right? Are there any women around here? Are there 6 of us? 6 women in the whole entire police science school. This was before criminal justice. It was police. And this is how it started. The counselors in the school started saying, well, Judie, it's really nice that you want to be a police officer, a policeman. Really nice you want to be a policeman, but, you know, they don't really hire women. So are you sure you want to be in this school? Well, you know, I just dug my feet in like, heck yeah, I can be a police. I'm going to be Honey West, so it doesn't matter. And so I'm just going through, you know, college, having a good old time. Well, you know, college was pretty rough back there. That was 1966. And the Vietnam War was starting to go full steam. My father is a naval chief petty officer. And I decided to get involved in the anti-war movement. Well, that didn't go too well at home either. But I began to listen to people's voices. And it was like, what are people saying? I never questioned being an American. I never questioned loyalty or whatever, nor had I ever seen an anti-war demonstration. So, of course, being a South End girl, I kind of got involved. But the thing that really saved my life was the YWCA. And the YWCA had what at that time was called the University YWCA program. And I met a wonderful woman, Elaine Zachariason, who was at WSU, and she kind of took me under her wing, but so did the communists that lived in my dorm in Regents Hall, and she was all like, God, Judie, how can you be a cop? They're just like the oppressors of the people. And I'm like, no, I'm going to be Honey West, you know? It's not going to be like that. And so she drags me into the YWCA, and she's just like, you need to do something. She's my friend Karen. We're still friends. And I go to the Y. And at that time, the YWCA was involved in racial justice. That's what it was called in the 60s, racial justice. And for me, if you know anything about the South End of Tacoma, there were all races of people who lived in the South End of Tacoma. And I went to First United Methodist Church, all different races in our church, even if it was a very small percentage. So when I joined the YWCA, I've always felt that in my family, you know, I can remember Ring Around the Rosie and saying the wrong word, and my dad hitting my sister and me up and down about, you don't say those words, what's wrong with you? And so I grew up in that kind of time. My dad always talked about how bad it was in the Navy and how the black men always had to work in the kitchens and how they were segregated and how wrong that was. And so we grew up during that period of time where we knew what was right or wrong, but getting involved with the YWCA made a change in my life you won't believe. So here we go. So the YWCA sends me to the National Convention. And I get to go to Houston, Texas, and I'm all excited. I never traveled anywhere, except camping. And so here I am at the YWCA, and they're talking about merging the YWCA. Now, if you go by the YWCA now, you will see it says the elimination of racism by any means necessary. That was the discussion that year. And let me tell you, it was a discussion. But in the meantime, the women at the Y told me, go pick up a whole bunch of stuff and bring it back. So the other women, they always have good materials. And so I collected all these materials on women's rights and all of that. That makes me go back to WSU. I have to do a little sideways here. When I was at WSU, the women's rights people were meeting down in the basement of the Student Union building. Or am I at one of those buildings? And we'd walk by them like, who are these women's rights people? You know? Who are they? And it was like, don't have time for that. I'm anti-war. And so what happened is, some of you might know Dr. Janetta Cole. She's a really well-known educator in this country. And Dr. Cole was my teacher at WSU in anthropology. And Margarita Mendoza de Sugiyama, their family, the Mendozas, grew up in the south end of Tacoma. And my friend Karen, the communist, all of us were involved in this big planning for an event that was going to be an anti-war event. And so the women came to me and they said, okay, Judy, you're going to talk. Oh, no, I'm not going to talk. No, what would I talk about? Oh, you're going to talk about the women's movement. Wait a minute, I said to them. The women's movement? You know I don't believe in any of that stuff. Nope, you have to do it. And it's like if Dr. Cole ever told you you had to do something, if you know Dr. Janetta Cole, she's kind of like Maxine Mims, Dr. Maxine Mims. I know a lot of you know Dr. Maxine. Well, you just did it. So I went home that night. We only had like 2 days to prepare. So I go home, and I pick up, you might have heard of this, the women in the early women's rights days. It was out of the East Coast. It was called the Boston Women's Collective and the East Press, Women's Press, and they wrote all kind of these little mimeograph pamphlets, you know, about women. So I went home, and I read those, and I read them, and all the stuff started rushing through my head again about this whole issue of, you know, the division of men and women. And all of a sudden, these light bulbs are going off in my head. They're just going off like, well, you know, this really isn't right. Here I am doing this and doing that. And I haven't even thought about being into women's rights, but I think I'm into women's rights. So we get up the next day, we go to the bookie, we're up there, we're all getting ready to give our speeches, and Janetta gets up and talks about racism and what's going on during the war, and African-American men that are told go to jail or go in the war. Margarita gets up there and talks about Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and fighting the grape thing. Judy, your turn. I get up there and I go, we women will no longer feed, flatter, or F the male chauvinist pig ever. And people in the room look at me like, Jesus, what did she say? I said, yeah, nice, huh? And then went into this whole spiel about women and what happened to women and how women are, you know, and it was like, don't they call that like, oh, you call it the awe moment. It was my awe moment. And that changed my life. Between social justice work, between the anti-war movement, between realizing about women's rights, and that it did pertain to me. I don't know who I thought I was, Honey West. I don't know. So the whole thing is once I got, this is the other part of the story, because I think all of us have a time in our lives that are what they call today, the new political term is pivot. Something in our life that makes us pivot. Something that just changes you forever. And mine was basically reading some materials I'd never read before, being with other strong women, and realizing that I did have a voice, and that really began my journey. I never could have done it without the civil rights movement. I would not be a feminist today or back then if I hadn't seen the history of the civil rights movement that continues and continues and will always be in the forefront of my life. But that pivot came about because I also understand the women in the bookstore who had to hide downstairs. I come back to Tacoma, which is another story. You'll have to hear that another time, how I got back to Tacoma, because I went to live in New York City, and, you know, that was great. But I got back to Tacoma and got a job at the YWCA. And the first thing I said was, where's the women's liberation? That time we were women's liberationists. We weren't feminists. We belonged to the women's liberation movement. And so where are they? So we had a little coffee shop here in Tacoma called Courtsy Coffee Shop. That's where all the little radical people in Tacoma met. We sang songs, we prayed for peace, and I'm asking people, where's the women's rights movement? Where's the women's liberation movement? Some woman came up to me kind of like, Judie, they meet up in a house up in, this was Hilltop, up probably off of Martin Luther King Way. And they meet up there on such and such a night. Here's a phone number. So I call the lady, and it's like, okay, so we're meeting in this little house somewhere in Tacoma. So I go up there, and it's like one of those things where you walk through the house, and it was probably one of those peace houses, because we had a lot of peace houses, kind of to the back of the room, right? And here's women. We had to basically hide to talk about the women's rights movement. So when you think about people that basically have to hide today, LGBTQ people that have to hide today, who have to hide who they are in our society, it just keeps happening. If you work for social justice, you see the struggle remains all the time. The struggle is still here. The struggle that I was involved in the 70s, it's still here. And so my journey in working in women's rights has been a journey in Tacoma of women like all of you out here and good-thinking men. We struggle. We do the best thing to make our community, our Tacoma, the way it is. If I didn't have Rosa Franklin, another South Tacoma girl, later on, when did you move to South Tacoma? 1968, she became a South Tacoma girl and did the most outstanding things ever. Where's KWA? Kind of east, kind of south. Only 2 blocks from South Tacoma Way, so that makes you South Tacoma girl too. And, I just want you to know that no one goes anywhere by themselves. Establishing who you are, what your identity is, what your gender identity is, who you are, it's not by yourself. It's never by yourself. It's all the people that you meet along the way. It makes no difference if they're 7 years old or if they're 70 years old. We all learn from one another. And without one another, I would not be the woman I am today. Nor would I ever have had the opportunities that I've had working in the women's rights movement, being proud that I got to work for the city of Tacoma for 30 years, making it before they threw me out. And, Karen was my mayor. She didn't throw me out. Harold Moss was my mayor. He didn't throw me out. A lot of mayors never threw me out. And it was because the women on the city council wouldn't let them. And so, praise to the women city council leaders in Tacoma that stood up for our little teeny tiny budget. And but now I'm continuing to be involved with the National Organization for Women. I am so proud of the women today, the young women today who are fighting, like our speaker who's going to talk, Ms. Franklin over here. What she's doing for girls is just amazing. And so I think if you hear anything from all of us here, because I know Amy and I struggled in the city together, we know each other. And that's how Tacoma is Tacoma. So thank you, all of you who do what you do for Tacoma.